Thank you. Senator Rubio.
Thank you both for being here. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to get a little broader because I think it's important to understand sort of the strategic vision behind our tactics on everything that we do. So if we go back to the late 80s, early 90s, end of the Cold War, and the gamble at the time was, if we created this international economic order led by the U.S. and the West, built on this global commitment to free trade, that this notion of that this trade and commerce would bind nations together via trade, via commerce, and international interest and economic interest, that it would lead to more wealth and prosperity, that it would lead to democracy and freedom, basically domestic changes in many countries, and that it would ultimately ensure peace. The famous saying now seems silly that no two countries with McDonald's in them have ever gone to war. That's obviously no longer the case. But the point being is that that was the notion behind it. It was what the then Secretary General or Director General of the WTO called that world without walls, rules-based international order. Others call it globalization. And basically, our foreign policy has been built around that. Even though it's an economic theory, it basically is what we have built our foreign policy on. I think it's now fair to say that we admitted China to the World Trade Organization, Russia as well. I think it's now fair to say that while wealth certainly increased, particularly in China, through its export-driven economy, massive, historic, unprecedented amount of economic growth in that regard, I don't think we can say either China or Russia are more democratic. In fact, they're more autocratic. I don't think we can say that they're more peaceful. Russia has invaded Ukraine now twice, and the Chinese are conducting live-fire drills off the coast of Taiwan. So I think it's fair to say that gamble failed, and we have now to enter. And I think the president actually hinted at some of that in his speech the other night, and we're now entering a new era. What is that new era? What is our vision now for that world in which not just the global international order and world without walls did not pacify or bind nations, but in fact have now placed us into situations where autocracies, through a joint communique, are openly signaling that we need to reject Western visions of democracy and the like. So before we can talk about what we're going to do, we have to understand what our strategic vision is. What is the strategic vision of this administration on what the new order of the world is? I guess Secretary Sherman.
Senator Rubio, that is...
Can you answer that in 2 minutes and 30 seconds?
Yeah, I was going to say, that's a really profound question that I probably can't fully answer in 2 minutes and 30 seconds. But let me say this. I think we all hoped for that vision. But what changed is that Xi Jinping is not the Xi Jinping of the 1990s that we all thought we knew. He is a man, as the President, as the Secretary of Defense has said, is the pacing challenge. The only country that wants to change that rules-based order that can successfully do so and are trying to make that happen. It is true that our way of life, our democracy, our belief in our values, in the rules-based international order is being challenged, and we have to meet that challenge. And I believe we can meet that challenge by, as the President discussed in the State of the Union, making sure we invest in our own country, which is why the bipartisan support for the CHIPS Act, for the infrastructure bill, what we're doing in the Inflation Reduction Act, all of the bipartisan efforts that have taken place here in Congress are essential to making sure we can invest in our own country to be able to meet that competitive need. Second, that we align with our partners and allies. When President Biden began his presidency, he said that it was critical to reinvest in those partnerships and alliance, and it is paying off because we are putting forward those values. Look at what's happening in our pushing back against Russia in Ukraine. And finally, we have to be ready to compete, which is why we have to look at supply chains and make sure we either can produce things here in our own country or we can do it with partners or allies that ensure we have the resilience and the redundancy we need to meet this challenge. But it is, above all else, a challenge about our values, and it is why the President really ended his State of the Union speaking about democracy, what it means, how we have to show what that means here at home, and what it means around the world.
All right, I only have 10 seconds left, so Secretary Ratner, a real quick question. I'm not going to ask you about invasion of Taiwan. Very simple. Is there any way that we end this decade without China doing something about Taiwan one way or the other? Is there any way you can envision getting to the end of this decade without China wanting to do something about Taiwan?
Senator, wanting to is quite different than doing it. So I think they have intention, but absolutely I think we can get to the end of this decade without them committing major aggression against Taiwan.
My time is remaining here. I want to talk a little bit about COVID and the pandemic. So here's what we know about COVID, okay? It originated in the city of Wuhan, where the Wuhan Institute of Virology, which has a questionable safety record and conducts experiments on making viruses that are not infectious in humans infectious in humans. They do it for the purpose of then developing a vaccine. They're located in that city. The Chinese CDC is also located in the city. Number two, unlike, for example, SARS, to this moment, unless it happened in the last hour, the Chinese have not been able to say, here's the bat, here's the pangolin, here's the animal that the virus came from. Number three, there is evidence, both in open source and I mean, it's been widely discussed that the Chinese, at a minimum, have not been, to say the least, open about any of this. And in fact, real clear indications that they've done everything possible to obstruct any sort of international inquiry into how this began or to be sharing this information. This is a lot of circumstantial evidence that adds together. And I believe that's why the FBI has concluded what on the origins of COVID, Director Ray?
So, Mr. Vice Chairman, as the committee knows, the FBI has long assessed, going all the way back to the summer of 2021, that the origin of the pandemic was likely a lab incident in Wuhan.
So, Director Haynes, I know that there's a difference of opinion among the different agencies. I think Energy and FBI have that assessment. Are we unable to, what is preventing the other agencies from reaching the same assessment? Is it basically the lack of a smoking gun? Will we not be able to say that we believe that the lab origin is the likeliest outcome unless somehow we can provide a smoking gun proof that that's what happened?
Thank you, sir. So you're right. There's a broad consensus in the intelligence community that the outbreak is not the result of a bioweapon or genetic engineering. What there isn't a consensus on is whether or not it's a lab leak, essentially as Director Ray indicated, or natural exposure to an infected animal. Those are the two operating sort of theories. And what would change, essentially elements' perspectives, I think it'd be additional information, and we've been trying to collect additional information. And I think you're absolutely right that China has not fully cooperated, and we do think that's a key critical gap that would help us to understand what exactly happened.
My time is up, Mr. Chairman. I would just point out that it is true that the lab leak, we don't have a smoking gun. Like we don't have some guy calling another guy saying, hey, we had a lab leak. We also don't have a smoking gun that it was a naturally occurring event, which is the easiest one for them to prove. Come out, have a press conference, show us the bat or the pangolin, whatever a pangolin is, and show us that this is the one and here's the virus that came from that animal. Because it would have not just been found in one animal, it would have been pretty widespread. That's the easiest thing for the Chinese to have done, and they haven't done it. I think that's a pretty strong reason to suspect that it's not naturally occurring because they've done it with the other pandemics. Thank you. To just echo the point the chairman just made, okay, on this issue of the documents. Let me just take a hypothetical. Well, let me start with this. Every agency of our government, right, they come here before Congress, have oversight committees, they have public hearings. Questions are asked. They have to answer them in public. People have to testify. The unique aspect of what your agencies do is, by necessity, it has to be in secret. Most of what you do has to be kept secret. That's the work of intelligence. So how do you conduct oversight over something like that? For a long time, there really wasn't any congressional oversight until the mid-1970s when committees uncovered all kinds of situations involving the intelligence communities, actually almost destroyed the CIA. And the result is the creation of this committee and our counterpart in the House. And so basically it comes down to a handful of members in the House and Senate who are entrusted with conducting oversight to ensure that not only is the intelligence agencies focused on the right things, but are doing it in a way that protects both civil liberties and our national security. Difficult balance. So now we come to, that's our role, and it's one we have to play very carefully and one that's really important for the country because we need what you do. But we also understand that left unsupervised, any agency at any time, especially ones with these extraordinary powers, can do things that are really troubling and end up actually threatening these agencies' ability to continue to work. Now, getting to these classified documents. I want to, just this hypothetical. If tomorrow I take a folder full of classified information, or anybody does, outside the building inappropriately, okay, for whatever reason, there's going to be an investigation. And there are going to be two things that are going to happen, and they're two individual tracks. Track number one is, I violated the law. I commit potentially committed a crime, has been committed because information that's classified was removed from its proper setting. And the result is that there's going to be an investigation, and it could involve the criminal justice system. In most cases, obviously, when it comes to former presidents, may require special counsel, but generally it's the U.S. attorney that's going to look at that and figure that part of it out. Okay? That's not our oversight, and that's not our job to interfere in that. Separate from that is the job the intelligence agencies have of assessing, okay, this is the information that was stored inappropriately. Here is the risks to the country if that information was seen by someone who shouldn't have seen it, and here's what we are doing to mitigate against that risk. How can we possibly conduct oversight over, A, whether you've assigned the proper risk assessment, and B, over whether the mitigation is appropriate? How can we possibly do that if we don't know what we're talking about? And that's really the situation that we're at right now. And that is that even though undoubtedly the information that was found in all 3 sites and so forth are things that we would have had access to, unless we can identify them, we can't begin to, A, opine over whether or not the risk assessment is accurate, and B, whether the mitigation that's been assigned is appropriate. We can't do our job. And a special counsel cannot have veto authority over Congress's ability to do its job. It just can't happen. It won't happen. And so it will change the nature of the relationship between this committee, which I think has been very cooperative. And I know we don't have a lot of competition in terms of cooperation, but very cooperative. And I'm very proud of the work this committee's done. And I don't want it to get to that, and it shouldn't get to that. But this is going to be addressed one way or the other.
Amen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for coming in. We appreciate it. It strikes me, I know you like history. Is that was that one of your majors? Did you study that?
Yep.
Yeah. And I think history is always instructive. One of the things that's most interesting about history is if you look back at these pivot moments in human history, the people that lived through them didn't realize that's what was happening. When you're living a hinge moment in history, you're busy with everyday life and everything else that's going on, and sometimes you don't entirely perceive it. So I'm pleased, as I read the beginning of your statement here, and I heard it before I came in on the broadcast, you wrote, "We meet at an inflection point. The post-Cold War world is over, and there's an intense competition underway to determine what comes next." So it's an acknowledgement that this is not what it was like 10 years ago, 5 years ago, very different. And that's important. I would argue that we're beyond simply a competitive, and I understand why we talk about strategic competition. And I don't say this with any joy in my heart, but simply because it's sort of par for the course in human history. I think we're entering perhaps the beginning of a period of conflict, which doesn't necessarily always mean military conflict, but conflict nonetheless. We have an all-out war in Europe. That's most clearly a conflict, and it's been a globalized one. People call it a proxy war, but it's been globalized. We saw that very clearly yesterday with Xi's visit to Moscow, but beyond that, sort of the way the world is aligned in different ways. We have seen the rise of, by necessity, militarization. Germany, Japan, nothing that we're against, frankly, because given the necessities of the world, but this post-Cold War, post-World War II order in which both countries decided that they were going to be less martial, less military, necessity has changed it for both of them. A positive development for our alliance, but nonetheless a reality. We have these 9 Eastern European countries that are even more hawkish than the rest of Europe. Geography puts them right at the edge of Russia's aggression, when they can see very clearly what's happening. We have the very clear outlines of this emerging conflict. The U.S., the West, the democracies in an alliance, the China-Russia alliance, they don't want to call it that, but that's what it is, in conjunction with others like Iran potentially participating as well. And then these dozens and dozens of developing so-called non-aligned nations all trying to cut deals for themselves. We saw that with Saudi Arabia. You see it throughout Africa, et cetera. And then on top of that, in this emerging block of 2 nations, it's not simply these military alliances. We're seeing the rise of alternatives to the SWIFT banking system, to the U.S. dollar, the growth of countries that now have a vested interest in figuring out how to evade sanctions. You see supply chain diversity. Europe is diversifying where it gets its energy, and the rest of the world is diversifying, because I think there's the understanding that the market is responding to the fact that we're entering a period of conflict. It is in that vein, given all of that, that I'm really concerned about whether we can continue to afford to do some of the things that we're doing. I don't mean from a dollar standpoint, but from a geopolitical standpoint. So, for example, last summer, the State Department released a report attacking the Solomon Islands for their stance on same-sex marriage. It alienated their partners there. The next week, they signed a mutual security agreement with Beijing in the Pacific, and the prime minister declined to participate in the commemoration of the memorial marking the Battle of Guadalcanal. That's just one example. I mean, I could take 10, 15 minutes to go through each of these here and point to different such places where we've sort of aligned ourselves in that way. Haven't we now reached a point where, frankly, we have to understand we are entering a period of geopolitical competition bordering on conflict, diplomatic conflict, economic conflict, and God forbid, but potentially military conflict, and as a result, need to govern ourselves accordingly. Not that these values or whatever our values may be don't matter, but our approach has to look very different than it did 5, 10, 15 years ago when, frankly, the U.S. was the world's sole superpower, and we had, in many cases, the luxury to be able to go through and do some of these things. Because it's not that these issues don't matter, it's that none of these issues are going to matter. If 15, 10, or 5 years from now, we live in a world in which the dominant economic, military, and technological power in the world is in the hands of authoritarian regimes who frankly resemble what the vast majority of human history looks like, and that is led by despots, where there are no individual rights, and all these things that have made not just our prosperity and freedom possible here, but the world a better place. Isn't it time for us to view the world through the lens, frankly, of the beginnings, the early stages of a geopolitical conflict?
Senator, I share your basic analysis, and I think that, in a sense, that's exactly what we're doing. We have worked from day one to do two things, foundational things. One is to support important investments in ourselves, which I talked about a little earlier, to make sure that we're as strong and competitive as we can be. And I think thanks to Congress, we've made those historic investments. And the CHIPS and Science Act is maybe the best example. But second, we have worked from day one both to re-engage, rejuvenate, and strengthen our existing alliances and partnerships, but also build new ones, new coalitions of countries and even beyond countries that are fit for purpose in dealing with different parts of the challenge that I think you described very, very well. Just to give you one quick example, when we're dealing with the challenge posed to supply chains around the world, to make sure that we have and benefit from diversified and resilient supply chains, we brought together countries in a coalition to do that, in many cases, near shore and friend shore, to have early warning systems in place if they're being disrupted, and also through something called the Mineral Securities Partnership, make sure that the United States and like-minded countries are focused on ensuring that we're able to invest in effectively some of the critical minerals that are so important to so much of what we're doing. When it comes to our engagement in the Asia-Pacific region, the Indo-Pacific, we have put that on full throttle. We've reopened an embassy, as you know, in the Solomon Islands. We're looking at other places in the Pacific Islands where we can make sure that we're present in ways that we haven't been in recent years, precisely because we are engaged in a competition. And I could go down the list of different collections of fit-for-purpose partnerships that we built to deal with exactly the world that you're describing. I do think, and you said it, that as we do that, the values that unite us are also hugely important to the strength and solidarity of these alliances and partnerships. Now, not every country that we need to be working with is in the same place that we are. I think we recognize that. And we need to make sure that we're adjusting and flexible enough for that. The last thing is this. There are a number of countries that are looking, as you know, very carefully at what's happening, making their own decisions, in some sense making their own bets about which direction they're going to go in. And from my perspective, this is less about saying to them, you have to choose, and more offering them a choice. If we're able to do that, for example, in being able to catalyze real infrastructure investment that's a race to the top, not a race to the bottom, they're going to choose us. We also have to have some strategic patience. There are countries that have had long-standing, for decades, relationships, for example, with Russia, where moving away from that, as they want to do, is not like flipping a light switch. It is moving an aircraft carrier. We have to work with them to do that. But I share the basic picture that you painted, and really welcome working with you to figure out the most effective ways to deal with it. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Rubio. I couldn't agree more that that's one of the core arguments for robustly resourcing the State Department and USAID is to make sure we're meeting this moment.
President,
Senator for Florida.
back in 2019, I believe April 2019, if not the first, I must have been one of the first people to call for the company TikTok to be banned in the United States. So it's been a while now. This is not something I just came up with the other day. But I do think that's a pretty extraordinary thing to ban a company. And so before, I think for someone like me, who's argued for a national ban on a company like this, to take away something from over 100 and something million Americans, and many of whom I've heard from, many of whom I know personally, before we do something like that, I think people deserve an explanation as to why. Why is it that we would want to do that? I don't think the answer can just be, trust us, it's bad for America. I think they do deserve an answer. And I think they do deserve a clear argument as to why it's in our national interest to do this and why it's the only option we have. First, I think it's important to understand how TikTok works. It's an ingenious app. No one argues about it. It's these short-form videos, and it always seems to show you what you want to see. And the more you use it, the more it shows you the things you want to see. How does it do that? Well, it does it two ways. First of all, it scoops up an extraordinary amount of data, not just data on what you're watching, all kinds of data. CNBC actually talked about it. TikTok, it collects your content that you viewed, content you created, shared, and beyond that, it includes your contact list. It collects your name, your age, your username, your emails, your messages, your photos, your videos, other personal information. In fact, in 2021, TikTok changed its privacy policies. It can now even collect biometric data, like your face print, that thing you use when the phone unlocks, and your voice print of its users. Extraordinary amount of data. But that's not the only thing it does, because I hear some people criticizing us, and all they talk about is, well, everybody collects data. It's not just the data. What really makes TikTok so effective is that it has an algorithm that uses artificial intelligence to combine all of this data and your usage. And what that does is that basically that algorithm, it knows you better than you know yourself. It knows the videos you're going to like before you even know you're going to like them. And it's an extraordinary power behind this. It's what they call a recommender engine. We're going to call it an algorithm. It's a predictor. Now, people would say, well, what's the big deal? All social media app companies do that. And not just them. I mean, Netflix does it to recommend movies you might want to watch, and Spotify does it to recommend music. Clearly, Instagram and Facebook and Snap and Twitter, all of them have an algorithm, and all of them collect data. So what's the big deal? What they're doing is no different than anybody else. Here's the difference. The difference is, of all these companies I just mentioned to you, the only one who has a parent company, that's a Chinese company that owns it, is ByteDance. And it's not just that they're a Chinese company. They own and they operate the heart and soul of TikTok, the recommender engine, the algorithm. That belongs to ByteDance. And in order for this to work, in order for TikTok to work, ByteDance has to have access to the data of Americans. They have to. Now, here's what people will say to you, well, but so what is a Chinese company? It doesn't all have to be American companies. Actually, the CEO of TikTok was here last week, and he said, ByteDance is, I'm going to try to paraphrase it, but I wrote it, is not owned or controlled by the Chinese government. They're a private company that's owned by outside investors that include Americans. Well, this is disingenuous. It's not true. And let me tell you why it's not true. First of all, there is no such thing as a private company in China, not in the way we think of a private company. Let me explain why. In China, number one, they have a law called the National Intelligence Law. And the National Intelligence Law of China requires, doesn't ask for, doesn't say we can go to court and require you to do this. No, it automatically requires. The National Intelligence Law of China requires every single Chinese company, that includes ByteDance, to do whatever the government of China tells them to do. China has another law. It's called the Data Security Law. And what that law says is that every tech company in China, like ByteDance, tech company in China, they have to hand over to the government whatever user information, whatever information they want. They have to do it by law. That's a big difference between them and these other companies. And so the bottom line is this, when it comes to those who argue that it's not a company controlled by the Chinese government. I read the other day that China says they're going to block any forced sale of TikTok. Well, how could China block the forced sale of TikTok if they don't control TikTok? The reason they can block it is because they control, the government, through these laws, they control the company that controls the algorithm that drives TikTok. It's controlled by ByteDance. And under Chinese law, if the government of China tells ByteDance, the owner of TikTok, to use the algorithm a certain way, they have to do it. And it doesn't matter who the shareholders, it doesn't matter if 100% of the shareholders of ByteDance are Americans. If they're located in China and the Chinese government tells them, we want you to use the algorithm and the data that you have access to in a certain way, they have no choice but to do it. That's not just true for ByteDance, that's true for every company in China. So a lot of people say, okay, well then the solution is this. Let's just store all the American data here in America. Let's just put it all on a server located in the United States, and that will do the trick. No, it won't. And here's why. Even if you stored all of the data that TikTok has on Americans, over 100-something million users, even if you stored all of it, ByteDance in China still has to be given access to that data. You may have it stored in America, but you have to give access to ByteDance. You know why? Because the algorithm that TikTok depends on doesn't work without the data. ByteDance has to have access. So that's almost like putting your life savings in a safe, but then giving the thief the combination. Who cares that it's in a safe? Who cares where the safe is? If the thief has the combination, they can get into the safe. And so it doesn't matter where you store the data. If ByteDance owns the algorithm, they have to have access to the data. And if they have access to the data, the Chinese government has access to the data whenever they want. The latest iteration is, well, what we should do is we should force TikTok to be sold. Sold to who? TikTok is worthless without the algorithm. So even if TikTok, as we know the company, is bought by Americans, they still need the algorithm that ByteDance owns. And you can't buy the algorithm from ByteDance, even if they wanted to sell it to you. Do you know why? You know why ByteDance can never sell you the algorithm, the recommender engine that powers TikTok? Because the Chinese government in 2020 imposed a law that prohibits it. The Chinese government specifically imposed a law in 2020 that says you cannot transfer the algorithm outside of China. So selling it is not going to make a difference, because no matter who buys it, TikTok is worthless. It won't work without the algorithm. The algorithm belongs to ByteDance, ByteDance in China, and they have to do whatever the Chinese government tells them to do. This is where people have said to me, well, who cares? Who cares if the Chinese government controls the algorithm and has access to the data? They want me to explain, how is an app that features funny videos and the latest dance fad, how is that possibly a national security threat? So let me walk you through a very realistic hypothetical. Let's suppose for a moment that China decides they're going to invade Taiwan in 2027 or 2028. And the key to a successful invasion or taking of Taiwan is to prevent the United States of America from getting involved. And the key to keeping the United States from getting involved is to convince the American people that we shouldn't get involved, because they know we're a democracy. They know that public opinion matters in America. And so knowing all this, the Chinese government goes to ByteDance, who by law has to do whatever they're told, and the Chinese government says to ByteDance, we want you to align your algorithm to shape American public opinion on Taiwan. They won't do this overnight. They'll spend a couple of years laying this out. We want you to align your algorithm to make sure that people in America are seeing messages that convince them that America should not get involved. And not only that, we want you to use the data to target specific American audiences with specific messages. So for example, some Americans might see a bunch of videos that allege to show people in Taiwan, probably fake, but nonetheless people in Taiwan supporting a Chinese takeover. Maybe family members. Remember, they have all this data on us. Family members of military members would see videos about how thousands of Americans will die if the United States gets involved. Others might see videos of Americans, or who they think are Americans, arguing, why do we care about Taiwan? We should be focused on our problems here at home.
And when we notice that they're doing something about it, that's what people will say, well, if that happens, then you deal with it. Well, once we notice that they're actually doing and we try to do something about it, you know what comes next? Here's what comes next, what's already happening now. You're going to have a bunch of small businesses in America who depend on marketing and TikTok. And let me tell you something, I don't diminish that. It's true. I know people that have built up their businesses and they use TikTok for marketing, and it works. It's better than the other apps for that. But just imagine when we go to them and say, guys, we got to shut TikTok down now because now it's real, now they're using it against us. Those people are going to come out and say, you're going to destroy my business. In fact, China will probably threaten those people. China will probably make it very clear if the U.S. gets involved, we're going to knock all the Americans off of TikTok, down goes your business. Those people will suddenly be asking their elected officials here not to get involved in Taiwan. And you know where we find ourselves then? Paralyzed. A country that's paralyzed, that cannot act in its own national security interests because we've allowed an adversary to basically use an app that they control and the data that they control to shape public opinion in America over an extended period of time, and we can't do anything about it. Now, here's where some people will say, well, this is a violation of the First Amendment, free country. I agree. You have a right to speak. I don't agree that it's a violation of the First Amendment. I agree that you have a right to speak and say anything you want in America. This is not about the content of the videos. What this is about is the existence of a company that is related to an important government interest. What is that government interest? It's not just a substantial government interest. It is the most important government interest that we have, the national security of our country. And preventing our country from being paralyzed, from acting in its national security interest, is the most compelling and important government interest one can imagine. Now, people say, well, this is all hypothetical. There's no evidence the Chinese government is doing any of this. Well, let me first start by saying that every threat to our national security begins as theoretical before they become reality. For example, China is building hypersonic missiles designed to sink our ships. They're not firing them at our ships today. They're not sinking our ships. They're not even threatening to sink our ships openly. But yet somehow everybody around here agrees we got to do something about their hypersonics, but they're not doing it now. It's theoretical, right? Russia's never not launched nuclear missiles against the United States, but we spend a lot of money every year on NORAD, on monitoring our skies, on making sure that we're being attacked. It's a theoretical threat, but one we've taken seriously for 70 years. Second, what's so theoretical about using propaganda during a time of war? There's nothing theoretical about propaganda during warfare and conflict. In fact, propaganda has been a weapon that's been used in virtually every conflict for centuries to demoralize and to divide your adversary. Third, this is not just theoretical. We've actually seen TikTok be used to drive messages and to undermine opponents. It was used to spread pro-Russian messages during the invasion of Ukraine. It's been used to suppress videos talking about Tiananmen Square, the genocide of Uyghur Muslims in China. It's already being used to censor all kinds of, in fact, it was used to control content and limit content about our elections in this country in 2022. It goes more, I can go further than that. ByteDance has already been used. ByteDance China has already been used to collect data on specific reporters whose stories ByteDance didn't like. So they used it to track the location of these reporters. Where are they? Who are they talking to? And in fact, here in America, TikTok was caught spying on American journalists who were writing stories that TikTok didn't like. And TikTok denied it. It's not true, it's a lie. And then they had to admit it. So now it's, oh, we fired the people who did this. And now they're under Justice Department investigation. But here's the point I would say about this whole theoretical thing. If God forbid, and I say God forbid, I really do, because no one wishes for armed conflict with anyone. There's nothing good about war. If God forbid we are ever in a war with China, China will use cyber attacks to try to take down our electric grid. China will use space weapons to try to destroy the satellites we have in space. China will use these missiles to try to sink our ships and kill Americans. China will do all these things, but somehow we think they're incapable of using a social media app with 150, 200 million American users They would never use that against us. They'll sink our ships, they'll shoot down our satellites, they'll shut down our grid, but they would never use an app that they control. Come on. Of course they would. Look, there's a lot more to say on this topic, and this is one we should debate and talk about. It's a big deal. Take this lightly. But I will say this, you know, since 1991, America has been the sole superpower in the world. I would venture to guess that almost everyone who serves here did not serve in government at a time when America had a near-peer adversary, for the most part. So I think we've generally, as a nation, certainly as a government, have forgotten what it's like to live in a world in which there's another country and another government that has almost as much power as we do. But after 30 years, that's where we are. That's where we stand right now. Whether we like it or not, we are in a near-peer competition and in many ways a conflict with China for global influence, for the direction of the world. Two very different views of the planet. With the government of China, by the way. Because I always hear these people talk about, we have no problem. The Chinese people are the #1 victims of the Chinese Communist Party on the planet. The #1 victims of the Chinese Communist Party are the Chinese people. But their government is very simple, guys. They want to be the world's most powerful country, and they want to do it at our expense. And the consequences of that is that the world's most powerful country will be a nation that puts Uyghur Muslims in death camps, that is trying to destroy Tibetan culture, that had no problem massacring their own people in Tiananmen Square, that as we speak right now are probably arming the Russians to commit these atrocities in Ukraine, that don't believe in any of the things that we are here debating about free speech and the like. We are in a competition, and we are in a conflict, though hopefully never an armed one, but nonetheless a conflict. And we have operating in our country an app, the fastest growing app, a social media app that has the most detailed personal data on over 100 million American users and growing, and are turning over the power for one day for them to use it to divide us, to paralyze us, to confuse us, to turn us against each other. Think of the damage that Russia did by putting bots, fake accounts on Twitter, and buying ads on Facebook. Can you imagine if Russia actually owned Facebook or Twitter? Not put ads, not put bots, actually controlled those companies, the damage it would have done to this country? Now imagine that in a country with an economy 50 times the size and 100 times more capability, because that's what we're facing here. It's not a game, and we should take it seriously. And if there is a way to deal with this that doesn't involve a ban or something drastic, I've always been open to that, but it doesn't exist because of the way this company is structured, and we better take it seriously. Or one day, 20, 30 years from now, people will look back and say, you guys should have taken it seriously. And we failed to do so, and we paid the price for it. We should act on it as soon as possible. We should ban TikTok because it's bad for America. It harms our country, and it's a danger to our future. I yield the floor.
Madam President.
Thank you all for coming here. Before we begin, just off topic, it's not what you're here to talk about, but I've sort of pledged to myself that anytime we have any representatives of the intelligence community before us, that I would drive this point home, even though it's not directly under your jurisdictions, but nonetheless, and I think it probably directed to Deputy Director Dixon and Secretary, Undersecretary Moultrie, and that is, let me just make this broader point first. Intelligence, by necessity, is something we keep out of the public eye, right? Because we can't conduct it in the sunshine. But there has to be oversight. And so that's why these committees were created. And I'm actually very proud to be a member of this committee. Most of our work is not on camera. Maybe why most of our work is productive, nonpartisan, and serious. There's no reason to show off in front of the cameras because no one's in there to watch that. But I think also because all the members on this committee that are picked individually by the respective leaders of the two parties are people that take this task very seriously. And I'm very proud of the work that we do. But it only works if we have access and we can conduct oversight. We have to know what the intelligence agencies, not because we're nosy. This is not a book. We can't tell anybody anyways. It's because we need to know. Because when things go wrong down the road, people are going to want to know why wasn't there oversight being conducted. And we know that classified information was removed from at least 3 from individuals that previously served in the government. 2 of them as president, 1 as president. And we need to understand what that material was, so that we can determine whether the intelligence community has established both the appropriate mitigation and the appropriate risk calculus as to what could have been revealed. We do not have that, and the excuse is an unacceptable one, that there's a special prosecutor process going on and that. In no way, we're not interested in the criminal justice aspect of it. What we need to understand is stuff, I would almost assure you we have access already to most of the material. We just don't know which ones they are. So how can we make a judgment as to whether the proper risk calculus is in place and whether the proper mitigation of any is being implemented if we don't know what it is or what we're talking about? So again, I know it's not anything you two handle personally, directly, but I hope you'll go back and say that the Intelligence Committee raised it again today.
Can I interrupt?
Yeah.
Because just so that we show, Stacy, this was not pre-wired. Before you got here, I shared with the committee that I had, had a very frank and candid discussion with the Deputy Attorney General and basically said exactly the same things, that while they're promising documents, within a week or so, they have not performed to date. And I think if you ask every member on this committee, we have a responsibility to the other 85 senators. So I just want to echo what the Vice Chairman just said.
Yeah, as I said, I think there's everyone is very serious about it, and I hope we can find resolution on it. The other one, and I'll be even briefer on this one, but I think is also important to us is, we had a Chinese balloon go across the middle of the United States. It wasn't a weather balloon. Everybody acknowledges it was a collection platform. We've had very little information or data provided to us, and in particular, no one's even truly informed us what role the All-Domain Anomaly Resolution Officer, ARROW, has played in that regard. Again, I don't know what. Maybe this is because it's a DOD Intelligence Committee sort of overlap, or whatever it is. These are things that we need answers to, and we just, to think about how important that was and how little information has been provided to the committees, particularly to this one, is something that I hope you'll also take back as concern number 2 in this regard. Now, on the topic that we're on today, I think it's a pretty straightforward one, and that is we need to be able to hire good people to come in and work for the government. We need to know who they are. I think this is a challenge because the backlog builds up because there's been improvement after the 2016 DOD system was implemented. But obviously that doesn't apply to all the IC. I think there's some issues with not reciprocating one agency, not reciprocating the other. And then there's this, and I'm not saying it's unnecessary, but this Byzantine system of read into some programs but not others, all of the different layers of compartments and so forth. But the main point is, I think it's getting increasingly difficult. I'm just telling you from people that I know, I've actively tried to encourage people to pursue serving their country at one of the agencies. And it's just really hard, because when you go see them and you tell them, well, it'll take 3 or 4 years to clear you, 2 or 3 years to clear you, who can sit around for 2 or 3 years to wait to be hired, especially when we're competing with the private sector? For some of this talent. There are a lot of people willing to do it. So I think that's what I'm most interested in learning is how do we balance the need to bring in people you can trust and understand who they are with the desire to do it quickly and enough so that this is a viable option for people that want to come work here. And I think there are ways to do it. I also think it's going to get more challenging. In some ways, it's probably easier to hire a 23-year-old because they haven't traveled the whole planet. And frankly, I would imagine that for at least half that time of their lives, they weren't doing anything nefarious, and the other half, well, but we can manage it. But when you're 23, there's limited windows, as opposed to somebody who's 55 and has worked in the private sector, and you need to know more about their background and the like. But I think the flip side of it is, I think it's going to be impossible in the years to come to hire someone who hasn't had a substantial social media profile and platform. What that has exposed them to, whether it's data or places they've traveled or people they've interacted with or relationships they have. I also think the nature of espionage has changed. It's not some James Bond figure rappelling off the side of a building. It might be someone who doesn't even know they're operating as a spy. But they're operating as an influence agent and those sorts of relationships. So all that is to say it's a tricky problem, but one we got to figure out, and we want to know what progress we're making on it because we need to be able to attract talented people to serve our country in these roles. So thank you for coming in.
Well, thank you, Senator Rubio. And again,
Thank you for being here today, for your willingness to serve, but I do need to touch on this. So you said in the testimonies now on the record, you've acknowledged it, that in your testimony, both written and verbal, in this committee in 2015 in July, you said that Iran would not have access to U.S. financial institutions. You've also said that there was a special license, which I think is well documented in the report that's now on the record, to allow Iran access to U.S. financial institutions. In particular, it was a specific license to a bank in Oman allowing access to U.S. dollars in New York to convert about $5.7 billion worth of Omani riyals into Iranian accounts and into euros. The report that is also on the record also found that OFAC under your leadership at Treasury, instituted about 200 roadshows. Well, first of all, OFAC actually encouraged 2 U.S. banks to convert these funds. That's what the report found. The 2 banks decided not to do so, but nonetheless, the U.S. Treasury actively encouraged 2 banks to do this. Then Treasury, through OFAC, put on over 200 roadshows across the world, encouraging U.S. banks to do business with Iran, and also telling members of the international banking community not to downplaying basically potential future penalties or fines, stating that 95% of the time, OFAC sends a warning letter or takes no action. In fact, the report found that at least 1 European regulator who attended one of these roadshows commented that foreign financial institutions felt political pressure to conduct business with Iran and Iranian companies. And in fact, the report also found that Treasury Department officials, while you were Secretary of Treasury, officials proactively contacted foreign financial institutions to provide information about the JCPOA sanction relief. In one example, a compliance officer proactively contacted a foreign financial institution to make sure they understood Iran sanctions relief. And this left the foreign financial institution confused since they had no business with Iran up until that point. So we send you a letter, then Senator Kirk and I, on March 30th, 2016, asking you about all this. We ask you about specific licenses and U-turn transactions, and we also ask assurances that the United States will not work on behalf of Iran to enable Iranian access to U.S. dollars elsewhere in the international financial system, including assisting them to gain access to dollar payments outside the U.S. We asked you this in a letter on March 30th, 2016, which I asked that be entered into the record.
Without objection.
You responded on May 11th of 2016, in which you said, we are not planning to reinstate U-turn, and we will continue to vigorously enforce the many sanctions that remain against Iran, including our primary sanctions that generally prohibit Iranian banks from clearing U.S. dollars through the U.S. financial system or holding correspondent account relations in the U.S. That was your response, and I asked that the May 11th, 2016 letter be in the
Without objection, be included in the record.
So we wrote you back in May, I guess 3 days later after this letter, a week after. So we are disappointed that you ignored the request in our March 30th letter, providing assurances that the United States will not work on behalf of Iran to enable Iranian access to U.S. dollars elsewhere in the international system, et cetera. And you responded on June 7th of that year. I asked that June 7th response be entered into the record.
Without objection.
And this is what it says. To be clear, the Department of Treasury is not working on behalf of Iran to enable Iranian access to U.S. dollars elsewhere in the international financial system, nor are we assisting Iran in gaining access to dollar payment systems outside the U.S. financial system. The administration has not been and is not planning to grant Iran access to the U.S. financial system. So basically, the way I would describe this is, your testimony is you were not providing them access to the U.S. financial system. You then issued a special license, which is not published, maybe no one was supposed to find out about it, to help them gain access to the U.S. financial system, then asked 2 banks to help convert the funds. They chose not to do so. You then put on 200 roadshows around the world, encouraging banks around the world to be a part of this and telling them, this is through your OFAC director, don't worry about sanctions, don't worry about penalties. 95% of the time, it's just a warning letter or no action at all. And actually proactively reached out, according to the report, unless you dispute the report, proactively reached out to a bank which said, we don't do any business with Iran. I don't know why they're contacting us. And then when we write you about it, not once, but twice, you deny or mislead that any of this was happening. So these are the facts as I've outlined. Do you dispute any of these facts as they're outlined? And I understand your point that general licenses, specific licenses. The bottom line is, this license was issued. It did exactly what you said we're not supposed to do. Then you guys did the roadshow. You even had people in the State Department saying, and the report found this too. This is not a partisan report. Okay, this report was put together by the Oversight Committee. It found these facts, including emails from people at State Department saying, we are concerned that this exceeds our power under the deal. So how are we supposed to see all of that and then somehow confirm you to this very important post when you've deliberately, in my view, misled me, misled Senator Kirk, misled the Congress on what was happening behind the scenes with regards to all of this?
Mr. Chairman, may I have a moment just to respond?
You may.
Senator, I don't think the facts are exactly the way you describe them. And I think it's important to distinguish between the technical details to facilitate implementation of JCPOA and more broadly welcoming Iran into the U.S. financial community. We didn't. And I took no actions that would do that. I don't think your description of what U.S. and OFAC officials were doing is the same as my memory of what I had people out there doing. I had banks and governments coming to me saying, we want you to do exactly what you described. We didn't do that. What we did was we said exactly what I said in response to the ranking member. We told them what sanctions were lifted, what sanctions remained in place, and we told them to be careful. And Iran got from that the message that we were telling people not to do business with them. That's why they sanctioned me. That's why I've been sanctioned for human rights violations in Iran, and I'm proud of it. We gave them nothing more than we promised in the JCPOA. We can agree or disagree whether that was good policy. But there are other members of this committee who've been sanctioned by Iran. I'm proud to be among them.
Well, just for the, I know I'm one more time, but it's for the record. That's not my allegations of the facts. That is, I'm reading out of the report by the Senate Subcommittee on Investigations, and I do think this needs to be answered.
Senator Kaine.
Thank you, Mr.
Madam President,
Senator from Florida.
I ask unanimous consent that the quorum call be vitiated.
We are not in a quorum call, Senator.
Great. I want to read here briefly from the law of the United States of America. This is the existing law. I'm not trying to pass a law today. And it says, Section 212A3B, subsection I, I'm not going to read the whole numbers. The law of the United States, Immigration and Nationality Act, mandates that you are ineligible to enter into the United States if you endorse or espouse terrorist activity or persuade others to endorse or espouse terrorist activity or support a terrorist organization. What that basically means is, if you are a supporter of a terrorist group, or you encourage others to support the actions of a terrorist group, a designated terrorist group, the statute defines what that is, you're not supposed to get a visa. And so it's reasonable to conclude that if you're already in the country, understand what I'm talking about. I'm not talking about American citizens. I'm talking about someone who's a foreign national, and that person is in the United States on a visa, and that person is out there defending or encouraging others to defend and take the side of a terrorist organization, like, for example, Hamas, or maybe Hezbollah or somebody else. If they're not supposed to have a visa to come into the country, once they're already here, if they do that, they should lose that visa. That's applying existing law. And so what I'm going to come here on the floor and try to do today is pass something that I frankly thought was common sense, doesn't go any further than this, that basically urges, it's not even a new law, it's a resolution that basically says the Senate is asking the Biden administration, if they come across anyone who's here, a foreign national, on a visa, who supports Hamas, that person's visa should be canceled, and they should be removed from the country through the proceedings involving removal. That's what this resolution does. It obviously does things like condemn anti-Semitism and condemn the horrible attack from Hamas, but all it basically says is if you are a foreign national in the United States, you're here on a visa as a visitor, you're a visitor, and you support Hamas, or you encourage others to support Hamas, you should lose your visa and you should be gone. That's what I'm going to hope to be able to do here today. And so I ask unanimous consent that the Senate proceed to consideration of Senate Resolution 413, which is at the desk, and further, that the resolution be agreed to, the preamble be agreed to, and that the motion to reconsider be considered, made, and laid upon the table.
Is there an objection?
Madam President.
Senator from Vermont.
Reserving the right to object. I want to make it very clear that there's 100 members of the United States Senate who absolutely condemn the brutal attack by Hamas on innocent Israeli citizens, that absolutely condemn the kidnapping of Israeli citizens and some Americans, who absolutely condemn the vicious kill Jews philosophy of Hamas. And all of us have an opportunity, which I think all of us are going to take, to stand by Israel when it comes to going after Hamas. And I hope all of us are also going to do everything we can to encourage that every precaution that can be taken to protect innocent Palestinians be taken, because they too have been kidnapped by Hamas, who cynically use them as human shields. But I read the resolution of my colleague from Florida. This is not about enforcing existing law. This is about compromising a constitutional right that Americans have enjoyed since the inception of our country. It's the First Amendment. And it may be something that people in this body may object to, but when a person is in the United States, they enjoy the protections of our magnificent founding document, to be free from unlawful searches and seizures, and certainly to be able to say things that we may find repugnant. And there have been many things that have been said that are repugnant. But at the time of maximum stress, and we're in that right now, is when there is the maximum stress to compromise the right we've enjoyed of free speech protected by the First Amendment since the founding of our country. And we've had some recent experience with this. You know, after 9/11 and the trauma that our nation experienced with the loss of over 3,000 wonderful people in the Twin Towers at the Pentagon in Pennsylvania, there was a call to go after groups to compromise rights. And in hindsight, in those times when we did do the wrong thing because we harmed innocent people, in our anger, our justified anger, by the way, we don't want to do that again. So this resolution, however my colleague wants to characterize it, is about what happens in this country. And whether this may be something my colleague disagrees with, but when a person is in this country, they enjoy the benefits of our Constitution and the right of free speech. I stand for free speech. My preference is that we focus on doing the things that this United States Senate can do to help Israel go after Hamas, to help all of the innocent Palestinians who seek to live in peace have that opportunity to do so. So, Mr. President, I object, and I yield the floor.
Objection is heard.
Mr. President.
Senator from Florida.
If I may respond for a moment, I understand my colleague has to go. I know it's late and other things going on. I welcome him to stay, obviously, but this is, there was a couple mentions about how I characterized the resolution. I'll just read you from the resolution. Resolved that the Senate calls on the President of the United States to enforce existing law to revoke visas and initiate deportation proceedings for any foreign national who has endorsed or espoused the terrorist activities of Hamas, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, the people whose rocket yesterday hit a hospital in Gaza and killed innocent people, Hezbollah, or other foreign terrorist organizations, which is a term that's defined. The State Department issues a list of who those are, that have participated in terrorist attacks against Israel and the United States citizens before, on, or after October 7th, 2023. Yes, we have a First Amendment right in this country to free speech, but everyone acknowledges there are limits to it. For example, you do not have a First Amendment right to call people to overthrow the government of the United States. You don't have a First Amendment right to do that. You don't have a First Amendment right to incite people to violence. And there is no First Amendment right to a visa. I'm not talking about U.S. citizens. And by the way, to be abundantly clear, this is very specifically written to talk about people who have endorsed or espoused the terrorist activities of Hamas, the Palestinian Islamic Jihad. This does not say people who support a two-state solution. This does not say people who are of Palestinian descent. It has nothing to do with any of that. People have every right to espouse those views. And I may disagree with them, but they have a right to do that. What no one has a right to do, especially a visitor, not an American, a visitor to the United States granted a visa for which there is no constitutional right, that we are going to allow visitors into the country. The law says they're not even allowed to be in. But now they're here. They got in because obviously nobody goes into their interview and says, I'm a Hamas supporter, by the way, in case you're wondering. So they let them in the country, or maybe they became a Hamas supporter while they were here. But they are here as visitors on a visa, espousing, defending, and supporting a terrorist organization that just committed a horrible slaughter, but has been doing it for a long time, not at this scale and scope like we saw in one day. This is not about First Amendment. This is people that are actively calling for the support of a terrorist organization that if they could would slaughter Americans. If they had the capability to conduct an attack like that in the United States, they would. There is no constitutional right to that. And there is no constitutional right to a visa to remain in this country. And so that's what I'm talking about. That's what all this is about. It goes on, obviously, to condemn the attack and all the other things, which I think would not be controversial. But that is specifically what this is about. The law is very clear. You're not allowed to create. It just makes all the sense in the world. Why would any country in the world say, we're going to give out visas to people who support terrorism? They wouldn't, and our law doesn't. But now that they're here, somehow they're immune to the application of the law. Now that visa is somehow a protected document. A visa is just like if we have to get a visa to go in another country. It's a country saying, we're going to allow you in as a visitor for a temporary period of time. But there are all kinds of things that can get your visa canceled. All kinds of things that could get your visa canceled. Like if you're here to do a certain kind of job and you're not doing that job, your visa, you're in default of the visa. There are all kinds of things that, depending on the visa you're on, that can get a visa canceled. Shouldn't one of them be support, open, espousing support for terrorism? Shouldn't that be one of the criteria that we use? At the end of the day, it comes down to this. We can go back and forth. We can talk about all these other concepts. But I promise you that all across America, I don't even have to take a poll. If you went up to the average person and you asked them, let me ask you a question. If someone is a visitor to this country, say they're here on a tourist visa or a student visa, or here on a visa as a visiting professor, they're here on a visa, and that person is out there supporting and encouraging others to support a terrorist organization that hates America, hates our values, but more importantly, that carries out violence, that espouses violence as their primary tool for activism. If you went and told somebody, should we kick people out of this country who are not Americans, who are foreign nationals, who are here on temporary visas and are out there supporting terrorism inside our country, I guarantee you the overwhelming majority of Americans would say, absolutely. Absolutely we should. I've had Democratic colleagues come up to me and say that today. And all this resolution does is it doesn't even force the administration to do it. It just calls on them to do it. So I don't understand the objection. I don't understand the rationale behind the objection. I hope we can maybe vote on it one day. Maybe we can get a vote on this. That way everybody could be on the record. We shouldn't have foreign nationals in our country that support Hamas or Hezbollah or any of these other groups. And I specifically tailored the language of this resolution to stick to the law and nothing more. I do not believe anybody should be out there committing acts of violence against people because of their ethnic heritage, because of their religion. I tell this to people all the time. Do people realize, for example, that in the Israeli army right now there are Israeli Arabs who will be called to go into Gaza and fight in the war? There are Israeli Arabs who will fight for Israel because they're against terrorism. Do they realize that in the armed forces of the United States, there are men and women who are Muslims, followers of Islam, who have fought for the freedoms of this country? This is not a nation where your value as a person or your status as an American is determined by your religion or your ethnic background. I reject that categorically. We're heartbroken, for example, by a story that some deranged person knocks on a door and murders a little boy the other day, screaming something about Muslims. That's a crime. I'm glad he was arrested. He should go to jail. And anyone who does that should go to jail. That is the kind of violence that terrorists do. No one is defending or talking about anything like that. What I am saying is common sense. You're a visitor. You're not even an American. You're a foreign national. You're here because we gave you a visa to be here temporarily, and now you're out there defending and supporting Hamas, a terrorist organization. You need to go. That's what this resolution asks the administration to do. And I hope we can get a vote on the Senate, so at least everyone will know where everybody here stands. I yield the floor.
Of course, or you espouse terrorist views and you apply for a visa, that's denied. You're inadmissible, right?
I believe that's the correct language.
So what if you already have a visa, and then while in the U.S. with that visa, you espouse or support terrorist activity? Shouldn't that be an automatic cancellation of that visa?
Senator, I would have to check the law, but I would understand that it might be a basis for the revocation of the visa. and the removal of the individual. I'd want to check the law in that area.
Well, I think it makes sense that if you can't get a visa because you espouse terrorist views or endorse terrorist views, if you have a visa and then you do that while a visitor, we're talking about visitors to the United States, that visa should be canceled.
I would agree.
Okay, good, because I'm asking the administration to enforce that, and I hope you will. I think that's important. Let me get, and there's a lot of talk about immigration. I deal with immigration every day because, as you know, where I live in Miami, virtually everyone's from somewhere else, whether it's another state or primarily another country in South Florida. So everywhere I go, I'm just going to be real about what people tell me. This is what they tell me. I talked to a lady 3 days ago. She says her son, I forgot the exact, he may be in Honduras. She's going to Venmo him $5,000, $6,000 or Cash App. He's going to pay someone to bring him to the U.S. border where he will present himself to border officials. He will be admitted into the country at some point, released. He knows this because other people have done it. Depending on how he's released, within 180 days, I believe, he'll have a work permit. And at some point in the future, he'll have to show up for a hearing, maybe not get an immediate trial date, but he's basically within the next 8 weeks is going to be living in the United States. This is the pattern that they have established and that they understand. And once he's successful at doing that, he'll obviously tell people back home how he did it, and they'll do the same thing. Is that not, in essence, what is happening?
I would perhaps, Senator, qualify a few of the facts, but that is indeed a pattern that we see, which speaks to how broken our immigration system is, but how important are the policies that we have promulgated to prevent that scenario from occurring. And let me give you an example of the policy that we have promulgated to ensure that that scenario does not occur. What we have done is we have promulgated a regulation that provides, it's called the circumvention of lawful pathways. Our model is to build safe, orderly, and lawful pathways to come to the United States and seek relief under our laws, and to deliver a consequence for those individuals who do not avail themselves of those lawful pathways, but instead follow the pattern that you have described.
But as of right now, the pattern I've described is the prevalent one.
That is one pattern, but the policy that we have promulgated, the model that we have architected, is in fact a significant defense against that in the context of a broken immigration system, and our policy is working, although it is under challenge in the courts. Our circumvention of lawful pathways regulation is being challenged in one court, and our lawful pathways are being challenged. And so we get hit from both sides, but the model is an optimal model that we are continuing to pursue during.
I understand. I don't mean to cut you off. I got your point. I only have a minute left. I want to get to one more question. My point on that, though, is the perception is as important as the reality. The perception right now still is. But this lady told me this on Monday, so this is, I'm not, I guess I can tell you that's at least one person more that's coming. I want to talk, and Secretary Becerra, maybe this will involve you a little bit too, about a specific category, this refugee resettlement, Cubans, Haitians. But let me just focus on the Cuban one because I know that one well. So if you come from Cuba, you are presumed to be fleeing political persecution. So you automatically are eligible for refugee cash. You're eligible for food stamps. You're eligible for Medicaid. Others who immigrate to this country have to wait 5 years for those and don't get the refugee cash. But within a year, depending if you're paroled, you can apply for a green card. And then you can travel back to Cuba as often as you want, multiple times. You can take cash. You can buy stuff with the food stamps. I've seen it. Okay, this is not, I didn't read this in a magazine. I've seen it. They use the food stamps, they fill up these bags, and they take it back to Cuba over there, or they just transfer cash back. Some people go back to Cuba for 3 months at a time. They've been here a year. How, if you are fleeing persecution, how can it be that a year later you are spending summers in Cuba? How can it be that less than a year later you're traveling back 6, 8 times a year to Cuba? I've never heard of people fleeing persecution going back to a place repeatedly. There's an issue here, is there not?
Senator, you respectfully allow me to say that you've misdescribed the Cuban Adjustment Act and what happens when an individual from Cuba arrives in the United States, because we do indeed remove individuals to Cuba. So,
Assuming Cuba will accept them and they're ineligible for some reason, right?
that is correct.
But the overwhelming majority do not get removed.
That is,
Which is fine. I'm just saying, if once you, I'm not talking about the people that are here. Once you are here, you're assumed here because you're a refugee fleeing persecution, and you have a host of benefits at a minimum. If a year later you're here on a refugee, but you're going back to Cuba 6 times, shouldn't you at least lose the refugee status?
Senator, let me follow up with your concern. The question being, if I understand it correctly, is if indeed an individual flees the country of origin by reason of fear of persecution, they obtain refugee status because
Specifically Cuban in this case.
Because, yes, because that fear has been affirmed and they are now a refugee. Does their desire and actually travel to the country of origin militate against the legitimacy of their claim?
Thank
it's a year later.
Senator
Yes.
Baldwin?
I will follow up on that, Senator.